Chapter 9, Act 9, The Drowned King. Act 9, The Drowned King. Cecil had finally become a paladin, but not even his death-defying trial on Mount Ordeals could have prepared him for what he was to face next. He stood in front of the doorway to Joanna Farrell's house. It was nearly dawn, but smoke was already pouring from the chimney above. He knew that any second Joanna would open the door to get her newly filled milk bottles from the stoop and find Cecil staring like an idiot, but he couldn't bring himself to raise his fist to the door. It was no secret to anyone that Joanna did not approve of Rosa and Cecil's relationship, or what little of a relationship they had maintained in the past couple of months. She felt that Cecil was a bad influence and that it was his idea to convince Rosa to join him in his battles, despite him feeling quite the opposite. And now he had to explain to her that not only he had let Rosa battle with him after rescuing her, but that he had let her fall into the hands of what was probably the most dangerous man on the planet. He knew that he didn't really have to confront her, but Amelia's letting it slip that she had been worrying sick over Rosa's disappearance had troubled him deeply. Although he didn't exactly know what it felt like to have a parent worry over you, he knew it must have had to have been a devastating feeling. Before he could change his mind and walk back to the inn, Cecil slammed his fist forward with one awkward, loud knock. A few seconds later the door swept open, and Joanna was standing there. She was dressed in a simple purple dress with an apron tied around front. Her golden blonde hair, the same color as Rosa's, was pooling around her shoulders in lazy curls. There were shadows under her narrowed brown eyes and a flour smudge on her cheek. You wouldn't have been able to tell by looking at her, but at one point in her life she had prided herself on not just being a beauty, but a beauty of noble descent. But ever since Rosa's father had died, she had dedicated her life to giving Rosa the best of everything at the expense of everything else in their lives. Although Rosa had her own lodging in the castle at request of the king, her lessons in archery and white magic had never come cheap, and Joanna had put hundreds of gold away in a marriage trundle to help Rosa woo the worthiest suitors. "Joanna," Cecil said, giving a bow. "Cecil," Joanna said coolly. "I somehow knew that you hadn't been killed. And Kane?" "He is alive as well," Cecil replied. "Although currently occupied." He knew that Joanna had always liked Kane far more than him and decided he should leave it at that. Kane had been born from the most noble of families, while Cecil had been a baby in a basket that became the king's charity case. "Rosa ran after you," Joanna suddenly burst out, reaching up and giving Cecil a smack across his cheek. His head snapped with the motion, but didn't say a word and didn't move an inch. "Where is she now?" She's not with me," Cecil started, his cheek throbbing. "Where is she?" Joanna demanded again. I don't know." Cecil sighed. "But I think she is safe." "You think?" Joanna gasped. "Is she all alone?" "No." Cecil hesitated. "Kane is with her." "Well, thank God for that, at the very least," Joanna said, shaking her head. "She'll be safe anywhere as long as Kane is there too." Cecil felt like his heart was about to fall into his stomach. He was ashamed to admit that he didn't trust Kane with Rosa at all anymore. Maybe he would keep her safe, but whose will would win if Golbez wanted to dispose of her? "You don't have to tell me. They're mixed up in this nasty Golbez business, right? He's been the king's right-hand man ever since you two were kicked out of town." "Yes, Golbez has them," Cecil said slowly. "But I am going to rescue them." "Well, as much as I appreciate the status update, I suggest you go out and do that right now," Joanna glared at Cecil as she gripped the edge of the door. "Bring Rosa back to me." With that, the door slammed in his face. Cecil sighed and rubbed his cheek again. It certainly could have gone much worse. Porum opened her eyes and groaned as the bright sunlight hit her face. Looking over next to her, she saw Porum lying in bed next to her with his eyes already wide awake, staring at the ceiling. "Good morning," Porum yawned. "Did you sleep well?" "I slept okay, but you snore a ton," Porum replied. "Is there a white magic spell that cures that?" "Oh, you are hilarious as always," Porum snipped. "Where are Tella and Yang? And Cecil?" "They probably went to buy supplies or something," Porum shrugged. "They were gone when I woke up." Porum swung her legs over the bed and hopped down, padding over to the window and pulling the curtains open even more. Outside she could see a few townspeople milling about, but they all looked like they were glancing over their shoulders every few seconds. She had always heard many stories about Baron. After all, Mysidia had once been Baron's sister city, but this wasn't the bustling town of heroes and beautiful maidens in travelers' tales. This was a ghost town. Porum looked back at her brother, who was picking his nose. Porum said. Why did you want to come with Cecil, anyway? Because Mysidia is so boring. Porum flicked whatever was on the tip of his finger and hopped out of bed. But I didn't think Baron would be this boring too. Where are all the dark knights and dragoons? Where are the airships? There's nothing here but some bar-brawling punks. He grabbed an apple from the table and chomped down. The real question is, why did you want to come? I suppose you thought it would be a good learning experience, right? Porum sighed and closed the curtain. Not exactly. Although I did want to help Cecil rescue his friend. After all, he protected us on Mount Ordeals. I admittedly had ulterior motives. Really? Porum raised his eyebrows. Are we sure Cecil's darkness didn't latch onto you? Not evil ulterior motives. Porum sighed, exasperated. If you must know. It wasn't just Baron I wanted to see. I wanted us to go everywhere that we could on the airship Cecil is getting. Porum yawned and took another bite of his apple, already bored. Porum looked down at her stocking feet. I thought if we rode the airship all over the world, and visited all these new places, that well, maybe we wouldn't recognize them, but they would recognize us. Our parents, I mean. Porum paused and swallowed, looking down. Porum pressed her fingers together. And we could be together again. I know eventually we would have to go back to the Elder, but that's a good idea, sis. Porum finally replied, tossing the rest of his apple in the trash. Probably the best idea you've ever had your whole life. Porum smiled a little. You mean it? I mean, do you think it will work? Yeah, it will work, Porum smiled more. Of course they would recognize us. Besides, just think about it, once we rescue Rosa, we're gonna get to beat on this Golbez guy and save the world. We'll be famous, and there will be no way they can't recognize us. Yeah. Porum grinned. I can't wait to get out of Baron and see everything, everywhere, ever. The twins were pulling on their capes and boots as Cecil returned, looking more frazzled than they had ever seen him. Why is your cheek red? Porum asked. I don't know, Cecil replied distractedly, walking past them and going into the water closet, shutting the door. Porum and Porum stared at each other and shrugged. Tella and Yang returned a few moments later. We've done a bit of scouting in the underwater passage, Yang announced. The monsters down there are fierce. But luckily for us, they're also adapted to the environment that they can easily be defeated with thunder magic. He grinned and flexed a claw on his fingers that spit out little sparks. And I had this modified just for the occasion. Good work, Cecil replied. We'll be able to get through in no time. Is everyone ready to go? The team made their way across down to the locked gatehouse beneath the ledge that Sid's home rested on. Yang unlocked the door, and a damp, musky smell instantly hit their nostrils. Ugh, gross. Porum groaned as they walked inside and shut the door behind them, enveloping them in complete darkness. And just how big is this place? A couple of miles long, Cecil replied. Watch your step, Porum and Porum. We're going down. They descended down a rickety set of wooden stairs and finally reached the hard, cold ground of the catacombs. The sounds of water dripping from the ceiling could be heard echoing all around them, and the shallow pools of water rippled as an electro fish swam by. Tella pulled out a wooden torch that they had purchased in Baron, and lit it aflame with a fire spell. Cecil took the torch and led the group down the winding path, while Porum and Tella took care of any monsters they could see poking out of the water by frying them with thunder spells. After what felt like hours, they emerged from the first cave of catacombs relatively unscathed. But as they passed into the next alcove, Cecil was startled when his feet plunged into icy cold water that went up to his knees. Careful! Cecil warned. Tella, Yang, hoist Porum and Porum on your shoulders. As soon as the last word left his mouth, a slimy aquaworm the size of a large man came slithering by them in the water, its jaws wide open and showing jagged, spiny teeth. Cecil grabbed his sword with his left hand and immediately thrust it down into the water, plunging it into the aquaworm's abdomen. The worm let out a hiss and began to sink into the water, black ooze pooling around Cecil's knees. A putrid stink began to fill the air.
We can't use thunder on the water anymore, or else we'll get electrocuted, Tella warned. Everyone, keep your eyes peeled.
Their path had disappeared, so they had no choice but to follow the flow of the water and to squeeze through the openings in the rocky walls that the water had eroded over time. Small, rocky islands were raised in the pool, but they led nowhere and were too far in between each other to use as platforms to step between. Eventually, they reached a platform that was low enough for them to climb out of the water. Tella and Yang leaned in and let the twins climb off their shoulders onto the land before pulling themselves up. Yang took the torch from Cecil, and then helped pull him out of the water. Cecil shivered as he wrung the water out of his cape. The platform appeared to rise upward to another alcove. Cecil remembered that the area he and Kane would train in as cadets would have to be coming up soon, and that meant they were almost to the castle. Taking back the torch from Yang, he continued to lead the others forward. After climbing a few clumsily carved steps, he reached a rotting wooden door with a rusty ring handle. As he pulled it open, it creaked noisily, like the screech of 100 bats in unison. But the other side of the door was a welcome sight. They were still underground, but they had at last reached what Cecil remembered as his training area from better days. Baron's military, long ago, had carved out and constructed rooms that soldiers could sleep or train in, and carved niches in the walls that torches could be hung in to light the area. It was downright cozy compared to the catacombs.
Shall we rest a bit?
Tella asked.
There should be a place in here,
Cecil said, walking over to another wooden door and pulling it open. Inside, a few monster-repelling crystals were scattered about in the shape of a circle, but they were covered in dust and their glow was very faint. A pile of singed wood, also covered in dust, was in a corner. From the looks of things, no one had been in here for a very long time. Cecil hung their torch on the wall and sat down on a protruding rock. Yang, Tella, and the twins sat beside him in a circle.
We just have a little more to go, and then we'll be in the castle,
Cecil explained.
What do we do once we get inside?
Yang asked.
Do we have a strategy? We've got to find Sid, first and foremost,
Cecil replied.
But I don't think it will be as simple as visiting Baron's prison. He would have broken out of there by now. I think we'll need to confront the king and get answers from him. He'll probably be very well guarded,
Tella mused.
But I'm sure it's nothing we can't take care of. We shouldn't underestimate Baron's military,
Cecil warned.
The Red Wings may be terrorizing the skies right now, but if the Dragoons are here, we could be in serious trouble. Even common foot soldiers cost us trouble in Fabul. Because they had all been transformed into monsters,
Yang sighed.
This castle might be full of them. I am distressed about seeing the king, though.
Cecil trailed off.
Why?
Palom demanded.
He's the bad guy making all this stuff happen, right? Are you a paladin or are you a puss? Palom, knock it off.
Porom hissed, yanking on his ponytail.
His Highness raised me like his very own son,
Cecil spat bitterly, more disgusted with his own cowardice than Palom's choice of words.
I thought I had made peace with betraying Baron, but something is still nagging me about it. Oh. Sorry, I guess,
Palom frowned.
I didn't know. And that's why you should just keep your cursed mouth shut.
Porom lectured.
Cecil, we'll be here, no matter what happens,
Yang offered.
Remember, you are doing this for Sid. And Rosa.
Cecil nodded. Calm, rational Yang was always right about things like this. Whenever Yang spoke, it reminded Cecil how much of a child he still really was. He decided that they should get going again, before he really lost his nerve.
The next area should contain the exit,
Cecil explained as he stood up and grabbed the torch again.
Follow me.
They left the campsite and wound around the corner to the north. But at that moment, heavy footsteps came from the stone stairway ahead, and two Baronian soldiers appeared in navy uniforms.
Intruders!
One of them shouted.
Kill them! They're even guarding the waterway.
Cecil gasped. Yang ran forward and leapt into the air, spinning like a top and slamming one foot into one soldier's gut and the other foot to the other's face. As they doubled over, Palom shouted stop! And the soldiers froze mid-fall before crashing into the ground.
That will keep them there for a while.
Palom grinned.
Let's hurry up!
Cecil cried. They raced past the soldiers and up the stairs through the exit. However, no other soldiers had been with them, or if they had run away. The next room was completely empty, and the team could hear the sound of water flowing above. As a precaution, Palom closed the door behind them and bolted it shut, pushing his ear against it to make sure the soldiers weren't recovering from his spell.
This way,
Cecil instructed, taking the torch and hanging it up before ascending a rope ladder that was dangling against the wall. Small streams of sunlight were glowing over it. He could feel the rush of fresh air hit his face, and then...
At last!
Cecil grinned, climbing over the small stone ledge that the ladder hung from and stumbling into the castle barren moat. A few moments later Tella, Yang, Palom and Porum splashed in after him. They were behind the castle, and from what Cecil could see, no one was at the usual post that he knew looked out over the north side. In fact, it was eerily quiet save for the gentle sounds of the water splashing against them. Just where exactly had those soldiers come from if it wasn't from the waterway exit? Had they been waiting to ambush them all this time?
Now what?
Tella asked.
How do we get inside the castle? We just need to go around the corner,
Cecil assured him.
Follow me.
They swam around the corner and saw what Cecil was talking about. A small stone stairway led out of the water to a doorway that could barely fit a man stooping over. Cecil fished the master key out of his pocket and stuck it in the lock, turning. It clicked, and swung open. After climbing inside, they found themselves in the west courtyard, directly across from the small tower where Baron kept prisoners of the law. To their far north was the tower that eventually led to Cecil's chambers, and to the right was the entryway that would take them into the heart of the castle, and to the throne room. However, Cecil was still troubled by the fact that not a single person was anywhere to be seen. He knew if there were prisoners he would have been able to hear them from where he was standing, and surely a guard would be on duty as well.
This place looks abandoned,
Tella mused.
Is anyone really here? I guess there's only one way to find out for sure,
Cecil sighed.
Let's go to the throne room.
Cecil led the group through the entryway that would take them inside the bowels of the castle. After going up a couple of sets of winding stairs, they arrived in the grand hall, which forked off to the west and the east to lead to various chambers and towers. The north fork led directly to the king. As Cecil turned the corner, past the black magic classroom, he heard a surprised voice call out, "Lord Cecil!" Cecil whirled around and was shocked to see Bigan, captain of the Baron Royal Guard, coming out of the east fork. Bigan looked the same as always, slicked back golden blonde hair that glimmered as much as his much-decorated breast. Bigan's cold black eyes, which always clashed with the wide grin Bigan wore, scanned Cecil and his companions accusingly.
You're alive? Or are you a monster? No, I'm alive,
Cecil said, not believing that he was relieved to see Bigan, who had helped unceremoniously get him kicked out of Baron in the first place. Bigan visibly loosened up a bit at Cecil's reply and smiled more.
Of course. The rumors were just rumors then. I should have known better. Bigan.
Cecil trailed off. There was something off about him, even more so than the usual irritation he gave Cecil.
Tell me you've not joined him too. Him.
Bigan blinked.
Golbez. Cecil.
Bigan shook his head, pushing a stray hair out of place with all the delicacy of caressing a lady's cheek.
I am captain of His Majesty's Royal Guard. My loyalty belongs to Baron, now more than ever.
Cecil sighed.
Forgive me, then. I'd heard that Sid is being held here. Is it true? I fear it is,
Bigan said.
I led what few remaining men I had left here to rescue him and the others, but only I survived.
He looked down and gritted his teeth.
I fled to find rations in the storage room to heal my wounds. And then was shocked to see you standing here.
I see, Cecil said, suddenly feeling horrible for being suspicious of Bigan, even if he was a pompous ass.
Will you come with us, then? Your blade would be most welcome.
Bigan might be able to talk some sense into His Majesty, Cecil thought. Bigan bowed deeply and swept his arm across his chest.
My blade is yours, Lord. Are you headed for the throne room?
Yes, Cecil said, and Bigan nodded.
Come, we have no time left to spare.
Cecil turned and had reached for the double doors when Palom and Porum both stopped in their tracks and looked at each other.
What is it?
Cecil asked worriedly. Are they scared? I keep forgetting that they are mere children. Perhaps we should hide them in my chambers while this plays out?
Something stinks.
Palom made a gagging face.
I smell it too.
Porum added.
A monster's stench. What? There are more.
Baigan gasped, whirling around and withdrawing his blade.
Be on your guard, lord.
Palom went up to Baigan and fanned his face.
Yuck. And his acting stinks too.
Porom walked over and put her hands on her hips.
You would think he would try a little harder to fool us, wouldn't you?
Cecil's face fell as Baigan turned to the twins and merely kept smiling. He felt as if he were going to throw up, like a wall had come crashing down on him.
Baigan. You have gone over to the enemy. Haven't you?
Baigan reached out his hand towards Cecil.
Why? Why must you keep accusing me of being some kind of traitor? I'm merely repaying a great man for the wonderful gift he gave me. Behold.
As the last word left Baigan's lips, his outstretched hand began to pop with thick, purple veins. The rest of his flesh began to turn a deep plum color, and Baigan suddenly exploded out of his uniform, expanding a couple of feet taller and wider with muscles multiplying by the second. 2 snapping jaws formed from his fists, with beady white eyes protruding from where his knuckles were. His head was the last part to transform, twisting and contorting into a crude snout of a dragon with glassy yellow eyes.
Look out!
Yang cried, pushing the twins out of the way as one of Baigan's python-like arms snapped forward and tried to take a chunk out of Palom. Baigan shuddered with delight and began to stomp toward Cecil with his tree trunk-sized legs. Cecil withdrew his blade and charged Baigan, gouging him cleanly through his abdomen. But Baigan merely gave a throaty growl/laugh and knocked Cecil aside with a mere swipe. Cecil grunted as he kept himself from stumbling and watched Yang land a flying kick only to get knocked back into the throne room doors like a stuffed toy.
We've got to take out those arms.
Tella cried.
Palom, Porom, use twin cast. We're working on it, boss.
Palom winked. Yang pulled himself up from the ground and charged again, this time successfully head-butting Baigan back a few feet so that he was further from the twins, but this time an arm snapped its jaws right into his arm, causing him to scream out and stumble back. 2 fangs were stuck in the gaping holes in his bicep, and blood mixed with some foul green color was oozing out.
Yang!
Cecil cried. There was no way Porom could heal him in the middle of a spell with Palom. Yang collapsed to the ground, his eyes rolling back in his head.
Blizzaga!
Tella cried, thrusting his rod forward and summoning a storm of icicles and snow around Baigan. Baigan howled as the ice cut at his skin and the snow blinded him. While he was distracted, Cecil ran over to Yang and attempted to drag him back toward the throne room, out of the immediate vicinity of the battle.
My arm! It's on fire!
Yang groaned.
I can barely move it. You've been poisoned, I'm sure of it.
Cecil gasped, positive that the wounds were only growing wider as he took a look.
We've little time. Ugh!
Yang moaned, closing his eyes. Tella unleashed yet another Blizzaga spell, keeping Baigan busy for the moment being. I've got to heal Yang myself, I can't wait for Porom. Cecil thought. Come on. What is the spell that dispels poisons? Cecil held his hands over Yang's wound and muttered Asuna. A twinkling golden light fell from Cecil's hands, like a drop of water, and fell into Yang's wound. The light mixed in with his blood and began to sink into the wound, the green ooze dissipating and eventually drying up into what appeared to be sparkling dust. Cecil blew the dust away from the wound and revealed 2 neat punctures that had shrunk to half the size they were only seconds before. Yang opened his eyes and blinked, flexing his fingers a bit before moving his whole arm up and down.
Cecil, you can use white magic. Apparently.
Cecil laughed a little. But the victorious moment was cut short when a loud roar exploded from behind them. Looking up, Cecil saw hundreds of shooting stars pouring down from the ceiling and explode upon impact with Baigan. The twins both had their arms raised, chanting furiously as the stars rained down faster, like a shower of comets. The snakes on his arms writhed and hissed angrily, and a large explosion of stars at his chest and feet caused him to jump and stumble backwards. Tella dove out of the way just in time as Baigan's bulky frame crashed to the ground, his arms snapping out of their sockets with a sickening pop, and flailing about helplessly for a few moments before crumbling into dust. Baigan howled and twisted back and forth, struggling to pull himself back up onto his feet as the twins ended their spell and doubled over, panting for breath. Cecil bolted up from Yang's side and ran to Baigan, pulling his blade from Baigan's abdomen and steadying his hands as he stared down at Baigan's serpent-like face. His purple, veiny jaws were snapping viciously, and there was no light of humanity left in his golden, pupil-less eyes. Cecil closed his eyes and swung the sword forward, the holy blade cleanly separating Baigan's head from his body. Cecil swore he heard Bigon hiss his name as his blade scraped the stone floor beneath them, but when he opened his eyes, Bigon's jaw was clamped shut and his eyes were dark as soot. A few moments later, the body sustained life no more and collapsed into itself as a giant pile of fine grey dust.
And that takes care of that,
Palom grinned.
Thank heavens, I wasn't sure how long I could keep up with the Blizzaga spells.
Tella wheezed.
I suppose I really am not as young as I used to be.
Cecil stared down at what used to be his ally, saying nothing. Palom walked over to Cecil and shook his finger at him.
You shouldn't be so quick to trust people.
Cecil didn't look at him and bent down, thinking he saw something glitter in Bigon's remains. He plucked out a freshly polished golden medal, a symbol of courage given to Baron's bravest of men in the military. Cecil and Bigon may not have ever seen eye to eye, mostly because of Bigon's dislike of Cecil's close relationship with the king, but he never thought it would end like this.
Even Bigon?
Cecil murmured, dropping the medal back in the dust and turning away.
Come on. King Baron has to answer for this.
Yang pulled open the double doors that led to the hall right before the throne room. Cecil glided past wordlessly, barely registering the sounds of the door slamming behind them. When he reached the tempered steel doors branded in Baron's crest, he took a deep breath and pulled them open. The throne room looked exactly the same as the day Cecil had been forcibly removed from it. A rich, crimson carpet led right up to the golden, ornate throne in the middle of the room, where King Baron was sitting, his head rested against his hand and a bemused smile on his face. Behind him, thick tapestries woven out of the finest fibers were hung, each one depicting a great moment in Baron's 700-year history. One of the newer tapestries featured an airship rising from the castle. However, there were no guards flanking his side, and Cecil couldn't even see any potentially hiding behind the white stone pillars that were lined up on each wing of the room. That was a little strange. As soon as Cecil's appearance registered in the king's eyes, he smiled more and sat up straighter, even as Cecil approached him with a hateful glare on his face. Cecil stopped in front of the throne and the king stood, clapping his hands together.
Cecil! At last, you've returned. And all the stronger for your journey, by the looks of it.
Cecil blinked, admittedly taken aback by the king's jovial attitude.
Your Majesty?
Cecil trailed off.
Cecil!
Porom hissed.
Don't let your guard down.
The king ignored everyone else in the party as he eyed the holy blade in Cecil's scabbard.
And look at you. You've become a paladin, is it? Is that what they call the myth-given blade, the sword of legend? But I'm afraid that just won't do at all.
King Baron frowned and stroked his beard gingerly, starting to pace a bit at his throne. Myth-given blade? Cecil stared at him incredulously. This wasn't going at all like he thought it would.
My liege.
Cecil finally found his voice.
Would you really not have me forsake the dark blade?
King Baron stopped and turned away from Cecil, staring at the tapestries hanging behind them.
My liege?
The king asked.
Who might that be? What?
Cecil cried. Palom and Porom gasped under their breath.
Oh yes, I think I've just remembered,
King Baron replied, letting out a soft laugh.
You must mean the old fool who refused to surrender his kingdom. Yes, that's it, the King of Baron. It's his part I've been playing all this time. Ha 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 ha.
Cecil narrowed his eyes. This was a fake king? The concept made perfect sense. After all, the king had pulled a 180 in his attitude and treatment of his people seemingly overnight. But if that were truly the case...
What have you done with the real Baron?
The king laughed more, and mist that seemingly appeared out of nowhere began to envelop his body, blocking him from Cecil's view.
Would you like to go see him, this king of yours? I can arrange that for you quite easily. You would best not mistake me for another Scarmaglione. How one as weak as he came to be crowned an archfiend is something I will never know. Then you're one of them.
Cecil growled, his hand readied at his blade.
Another archfiend.
Porom gasped. The king disappeared within the mist, which had begun to fill the entire throne room. Cecil backed away from the throne and stood with his back against Yang's, raising his blade. The twins huddled together, their eyes darting all over the now obscured room. Tella was muttering a spell. Suddenly, there was a vicious growl, and a large, shadowed figure leapt from the throne and crashed down upon Cecil and his allies. Luckily, at that very moment, Tella cried "Protect!" And a yellow bubble surrounded the team before the figure could smash into them. It bounced off the barrier, laughing as it did a backflip and landed on 4 legs. The barrier disappeared, and the mist began to fade away, revealing what had attacked them. It was a large, blue monster that could only properly be described as half turtle and half human. A gigantic azure shell enveloped the beast, which rested on 4 bowed legs with ivory claws clicking at the stone floor. A whippet of a tail protruded from the rear end. A long neck extended from the front of the shell, and a terrifying blue face appeared. The flesh was scaly, like a reptile's, and pulled back so taut that the markings and protrusions on the creature's skull could be seen through the skin. Its jaw was pulled up in a wide grin, with 2 rows of jagged yellow teeth snapping against each other constantly, almost like it had a twitch. Its eyes consisted of nothing but 2 white milky orbs, and Cecil had the discomforting realization there was no way of telling who the beast was looking at.
I am the drowned king, Cagnazo.
The creature growled, and a long, forked pink tongue poked out of its mouth, running along its teeth.
The archfiend of water and sworn servant of Golbez. Bow down before me.
Water began to swell at the base of Cagnazo's feet, rising quickly. Cecil tried to swing at Cagnazo's head, but the water surged in front of him and created a protective barrier, pain surging through Cecil's arms as he struck what felt like a brick wall. As he stumbled back, Cagnazo laughed and the water surged forward in a wave the height of a man, crashing against Cecil and the others and throwing them back against the far wall of the throne room. Cecil felt his head smash back against the throne room doors and sunk down against it, the room spinning.
Arg! Is everyone okay?
Cecil muttered.
Palom and Porum have been knocked out cold.
Tella cried. Cecil tried to look over, and saw the twins slumped over against each other, soaked. Yang stood up and charged Cagnazo with a loud cry, slamming his fist into his head. The electricity from Yang's claws surged through Cagnazo, causing him to scream and withdraw into his shell. Yang started to punch and kick at the shell, but it did no good. He didn't notice that water had begun to rise around Cagnazo again in his frenzy.
Look out!
Cecil cried, but it came too late. The water had enveloped Yang's legs and trapped him in a swirling whirlpool up to his waist. Cagnazo poked his head out of his shell and grinned, his tongue slapping Yang in the face before Cecil could raise the warning.
Thundaga!
Tella yelled. A blinding shower of lightning came crashing down from the ceiling, striking Cagnazo in the face. Cagnazo let out a howl and the water surrounding him disappeared, rising up in the sky as steam. Yang broke free and gave a roundhouse kick to Cagnazo's face, feeling his jaw shatter under his foot. Cagnazo, stunned from the lightning and the surging pain from Yang's kick, collapsed onto the floor. Cecil gasped. So these were the powers that Tella had recalled on Mount Ordeals. The power was incredible.
Again, Tella!
Cecil cried.
Before he tries to retreat into his shell. Arg!
Tella grunted, raising his staff again as another round of lightning rained from above. Cagnazo let out a deafening cry as the electricity fried him from the inside out, his shell cracking and exploding open, water that had been stored within it pouring out into the room. Smoke rose from his blackened flesh as the lightning subsided. But before Cagnazo's head could hit the ground, the rest of his form broke down and turned into dust, floating away in the pools of water. Yang sighed and cracked his knuckles.
A formidable foe, indeed. And he made it sound like there were more. We fought the Fiend of Earth on Mount Ordeals,
Cecil explained as he slowly pulled himself up from the ground, shivering as water poured out of his armor.
They are minions of Golbez's.
He looked down at the ground and bit his lip. How long had Cagnazo been sitting upon the throne, and how had he never noticed?
Wake up, you two!
Tella exclaimed, casting raise spells over Palom and Porum. The two opened their eyes simultaneously, looking at each other and pouting.
I guess we missed the fun.
Palom asked.
I guess we did,
Porum replied. Thundering footsteps suddenly broke out, and Cecil could barely dive out of the way just in time as the throne room doors burst open, making the whole room shake.
You filthy imposter!
A stout, rotund figure stomped into the room, a wooden hammer raised high in his arms.
You've got another thing coming if you think you can lock me up in a musty old style like that.
He paused when he realized there was nothing on the throne except a pool of dripping water, and lowered his hammer, scratching his head. Cecil couldn't help but grin as he ran over and tackled the man from behind.
Sid! Gah!
Sid cried, throwing Cecil off of him and stumbling backwards.
Cecil! Are you a ghost? No,
Cecil replied, laughing. Sid muttered something incomprehensible as he rested his hand over his heart.
You're alive!
Sid sighed, and started to sputter.
You had me worried, you.
He reached up and pulled his goggles over his eyes, and Cecil realized with delight that Sid was trying to hide that he was crying. There was no doubt about it, this was the real Sid.
I'm sorry,
Cecil apologized, although he was still smiling. Sid waved his apologies away and regained his composure, looking around at the others, who were shamelessly staring at the spectacle Sid had caused. The twins were half frightened and half fascinated by this burly being, who could have passed for a dwarf in the right lighting. Dirt and twigs were hanging out of his wild red beard, which covered most of his face and chest, his clothes were filthy, and his purple goggles made him look like a derelict. His stumpy legs couldn't have been much bigger than one of the twins themselves, and his big hands were wrapped in leather gloves that were falling apart at the seams. Tella and Yang were a bit more discreet in their bewilderment.
Where is Rosa?
Sid asked, ignoring them for now.
She ran off after you, she was convinced you were still alive. But I haven't seen her since. She was taken by Golbez,
Cecil replied, a twinge of shame in his voice. Sid puffed out his chest and threw his hands in the air.
While you were with her? How could you let that happen?
Cecil looked down and Sid began to pace in circles.
HMMPH? Golbez, not enough for him to steal my airships. Has to go and take Rosa, too. And she is in danger.
Tella snapped.
So if you wouldn't mind leading us to this flying ship of yours, perhaps we could talk on the way.
Sid huffed and stomped up to Tella, sticking his finger right in Tella's face.
And who does this testy old-timer think he is,
Sid demanded. Tella snorted and shoved Sid's hand away.
One might ask the same of you. Are you calling me old?
Cecil rolled his eyes and Porum stepped between the two men, slamming the end of her staff on the floor to get their attention. They stopped arguing and both stared down at the little girl.
Please, let's not argue.
Porum cried. She turned to Sid.
You're Sid, right?
She nodded her head toward Tella.
This is Tella, a great sage and wizard.
She then pointed to Yang, who had been respectfully standing off to the side, not wanting to be dragged into anything.
And this is Yang, Grand Master of the Fabulian monks. My name is Porum. I am an apprentice mage from Mysidia.
Porum snorted loudly.
Grown old men, acting like children. The one who doesn't know how to mind his tongue is my twin brother, Porum
said dryly.
You're just a goody-goody.
Porum snapped. As the children began to bicker, Yang pressed his hands together and bowed to Sid.
It is an honor to meet you, sir. But I fear our situation does dictate haste. Oh, now there's a man who knows some manners.
Sid boomed. He gave Yang a hearty slap on the back and Cecil tapped his foot on the floor.
Sid, are there any airships that haven't been taken by Golbez? Haha, oh yes.
Sid grinned.
I've hidden a brand new one, state of the art. And in a place nobody would ever think to look. I thought it might come in handy one day, so. We don't have time for this blathering.
Tella cried.
Rosa's life is at stake. I know that.
Sid bellowed.
No need to be shouting about it, I heard ya the first time.
Tella stared at him incredulously, and Sid rubbed his nose and picked up his hammer.
Well then. Follow me.
Sid pushed past the group and led them into the hall ahead.
I hope this buffoon doesn't think he is coming with us.
Tella muttered. As they stepped into the hallway, the throne room doors slammed shut behind them. Startled, Cecil looked back at them to make sure no one had followed them. But no one was there, save for the twins. Suddenly, the torches in the hallway extinguished, and everything fell dark. Porum and Porum gasped, holding on to Cecil's cape. A wicked laughter filled the hall, which sounded like it was coming from beneath them.
The drowned King Cagnazo, deposed.
The laughter continued, and Cecil recognized the fake King Baron's voice.
But the wicked are not wont to fall alone.
There was a loud rumbling, and Cagnazo laughed harder.
In life, I was terrible, in death, steeped in terror greater still. Drink long and deep of it ere you die. I'll save a briny pit for you in hell, mwahahaha.
The rumbling grew louder and grating, like a grinding millstone. The flames erupted from their torches once more and the room filled again with light. But now Cecil could see where the noise was coming from, it was all around them, and little chips of stone and dust were raining upon them from above. The floor shook violently as the walls surrounding them began to move in, sliding several inches a second.
The walls.
Tella gasped.
They're moving.
Cecil immediately ran back to the throne room, pulling on the latches of the doors with all his strength. However, they wouldn't budge.
It's barred.
Cecil moaned. Tella pulled on the doors to the grand hall.
These two. We'll push them back.
Yang cried, slamming himself against a wall and pushing back against them. Cecil and Tella ran to the right side wall, Tella pushing forward and Cecil leaning back against it, pushing with his legs. However, the walls continued to slide forward, and eventually they exhausted their strength and had to give up. What the hell are we going to do? Cecil thought. It can't end here. In about a minute these walls are going to crush us to dust. Palam and Porum looked at each other, and nodded. Palam ran to the left wall, and Porum to the right.
Palam, Porum!
Cecil cried.
Get away from there! Cecil!
Palam trailed off for a moment, and looked away.
We'll miss you. It was almost as if we had gained an older brother.
Porum sniffled, a tear running down her cheek.
What's gotten into you two?
Tella demanded.
Come here this instant. We simply won't let you die like this.
Porum sniffled, and then smiled weakly at the old sage.
Master Tella, look after Cecil for us.
Palam smiled too, and nodded at his sister. Porum nodded back.
Together now.
Porum called, and she and Palam both pushed against their respective walls.
Right.
Palam cried.
1, 2, 3. Break.
A white light spiraled around each of the twins, starting at their feet and shooting up towards their heads. As the light passed over their flesh and disappeared, their skin and clothes began to turn a cold, grey color. The walls had reached their outstretched hands, but came to a grinding halt when the twins would not move out of their way.
Palam. Porum.
Cecil trailed off, walking over to Porum and touching her hair. She was as cold as ice, and felt like a golem. Tella made a tsking noise and shook his head.
They turned themselves into stone? Hold on now, the cure is quite simple. Isyuna.
Tella waved his staff over the twins. However, nothing happened.
The spell has no effect.
Sid asked quietly.
Are you doing it right, you senile thing?
He dug in a pouch hanging from his waist and pulled out a medicinal item called a golden needle, which was specifically made to cure those who had been turned to stone. Pulling the cap off of the needle, Sid pushed it into Palam's arm. However, the tip of the needle clumsily broke off, and the contents spilled out onto the floor, pooling at Palam's feet.
They became stone upon their own will,
Yang said softly.
I fear there is no cure we can administer. Fools!
Tella muttered, lowering his head.
If any of us had to die, it ought to have been me. They were only children.
Yang lowered his head. Sid crushed the empty golden needle between his fingers and cursed, tossing it aside.
I'll fire up the Enterprise, and we'll avenge them both.
Cecil stared at Porum, still too stunned to believe that the twins had been there 1 second, and then gone the next. Even though they had only known each other for a few days, he knew that they were something truly innocent and good in a world that was becoming more and more twisted with each passing hour. Porum held a soft smile on her lips, but he noticed that a delicate, single tear had been rolling down her cheek when the spell was cast. Palam was petrified with the wicked grin Cecil had grown to understand was his trademark smile. Cecil slammed his fist into the wall and looked up at the ceiling, screaming from the core of his very being.
You will answer for this, Golbez.
End of chapter. Chapter end.